think we may as well go ahead and get started. It is after 3 now, and the first couple of slides are sort of boilerplate that hopefully a lot of people have seen already. So if we do have some stragglers, hopefully they won't miss too much. So thanks everyone who could join us here. I know it's been a great camp so far, and there's lots of great sessions in this particular time slot. So definitely grateful to all of you who have been able to join us. I'm going to talk about what you can do once you have your great idea for a Drupal module, really more from a process standpoint in terms of sort of planning and building out that module, the approach side of things, as well as kind of getting the word out and helping to drive community adoption. So let's go ahead and kind of reiterate a couple of points that were made this morning in kind of the kickoff session. This really is meant to be a safe space. So whether you are an attendee, a speaker, a sponsor, or a volunteer, definitely should be not getting any harassment. And if you encounter that kind of treatment from anybody, there are definitely people that you can contact to make sure that we get that sorted out for you. So definitely the phone numbers here for a couple of the organizers. You can post it in the Slack channel or try and reach out via email. Also a reminder that tomorrow's contribution day. So going to be lots of great workshops and a couple of initiatives that we're going to really focus on. So definitely a good opportunity to meet some new folks, maybe learn some new skills, and really be part of that effort of giving back to the community. So hopefully we will see you there. My name is Martin Anderson Klutz. I go by Manclue on Drupal.org, as well as various social platforms, and I work for Digital Echidna. So I wanted to, I guess, level set some expectations around what this talk will be. It's really largely based on my own experience. And so as you get into the Drupal community, you may have some different experiences and would definitely be interested at the end of this talk of maybe hearing from some other people in terms of, if they've had some different experiences and so on. Really, this overall talk is intended to be more about how and why you can build out your module as opposed to, sort of snippets of code to use or some of those more technical pieces, and really wanted this to be a resource guide. So the slides have actually been added to the session listing now, and you can download those. You can look through them as we go through, but mainly to be able to use the links that I put in here, so that some of these pieces that are, there's lots of great documentation on Drupal.org and other places that we're not really going to go into in detail here, but wanted to try and collect those together so that as you go through this process, you can definitely have those to use as reference. And then the last thing is, this is the closest we come to really having any code in this presentation. Really wanted to make sure that it's not going to be intimidating, and hopefully, regardless of your experience in working with Drupal, this will give you some ideas in terms of how you can go ahead and plan and build out your module. So you've got a great idea for a module. You're passionate about some way in which you think that you can make Drupal better, or make it even solve some kind of a use case that has never been able to address before. And so there are a couple of things that I hope that you'll think about in terms of really trying to, I would say, crystallize the idea of what that module is going to be. The first one is really to have kind of a clear understanding of what's the problem that you're trying to solve with your module. And by really distilling that down into a very clear idea, we're going to talk a little later as we go through a couple of other ways that that's going to help as you go through that process of kind of building and promoting your module. Also think about something called Jacob's Law. So this is based on Jacob Nielsen, who's one of the pioneers of UX and the founder of the sort of world-renowned Nielsen-Norman group. And Jacob's Law is really that every visitor who comes to your site has come to your site after having visited hundreds of other websites. And so they have a whole set of preconceived ideas about how a website should work. And as you start to think through and build out different kinds of interfaces that could be implemented by your module, really try and think about what are those mental models that people are bringing with them when they come to interact with whatever the thing is that you're building. And so you should really try to either adopt those mental models, or at least adapt them, and not make what you're building so unfamiliar that it's just going to confuse them and they'll sort of get frustrated and leave, right? And then the last sort of key piece is to try and think about, should your module be a toolkit or should it be a solution? So when you think about a module like, let's say, image API optimize, out of the box, it doesn't really do a whole lot. You have to sort of configure it, maybe even add on some additional modules to use a third-party service like Resmush it. So that's more of a toolkit because it gives capabilities to Drupal, but it doesn't actually help it to start doing things out of the box. Whereas if you think about a module like EU cookie compliance, from the minute you install that, it's starting to put up that little message when visitors come to your site around, will you accept the cookies or not? It's not that one approach is necessarily better than the other. They're both extremely valuable modules for the overall community. But you might start to think about, is one approach better, or maybe both for your module in terms of how you think people are really going to want to be able to use it. So the next step is something that I really like to do, which is to build out a quick proof of concept. Hopefully this is something for, let's say, a smaller idea. You might be able to build a proof of concept in an hour or two. It might take a day or two, depending on how complex the idea is, but sort of a quick test to try and build out something to test the feasibility of what you're trying to do. And so if you're talking about trying to, I don't know, build out a brand new field widget, then doing the smallest, simplest version of the change that you want to create can help you to prove to yourself, A, that it's feasible and it'll work. For me, I find that it gets me excited to keep going and going through the other steps of the process to sort of be able to visualize that change that I'm hoping to make. And then the other thing that's really powerful is then you can potentially show it to other people and say, hey, have a look at this thing that I'm working on that I want Drupal to be able to do. And they can give you some feedback. They might even say, oh, that would be a great add-on to this other module, or have you looked at this other thing? And you can start to have some dialogue around something concrete as opposed to just having to describe it to them. So from there, I think it's really valuable to start doing a little bit of research. Definitely, you don't want to invest a lot of time before there may already be a module that does something really similar to what it is that you want to do. So if there is an existing module, you definitely want to find that as soon as possible. There may be modules that aren't identical, but maybe have significant overlap. And so finding those is obviously going to be very valuable. It may also be the case that there's not so much a Drupal module, but maybe it's a PHP library or a JavaScript library or a CK editor plugin. There may be other things that you could use to get you part of the way, and definitely understanding where those potentially time-saving resources is going to be really powerful. So to look for some of those things, I would definitely start with Drupal.org. Do some searches on there for existing modules. Also try and use Google, particularly, again, if you're looking for some of those libraries and something like, let's say, a CK editor plugin. And also try and remember to use different verbiage as you do some of those searches, because you may think of something in terms of, let's say, recurring dates, but maybe the module is called recurring events and some of those kinds of things. And particularly for the searches on Drupal.org, they may not necessarily have the capability to look across synonyms that way built in. The other thing too is if you do find, again, some of those modules that have maybe some overlap, but aren't exactly what you have in mind, maybe there's enough of an overlap that what you want to do could actually be, let's say, a feature request on that existing module. And so at that point, you're really not having to do as much work in terms of building a whole new module from scratch, but you could file a feature request, maybe even start working on a patch to help that module do what you have in mind. Or it's also possible that module will be looking for co-maintainers. And so you could talk to the original maintainer about becoming a co-maintainer, and then helping that module to kind of grow and evolve, and potentially in some future release, it could include that new functionality that you have in mind. And something else that I like to think about is, are there analogous modules? So if there's something that I want my module to do and I'm not really sure how to do it, sometimes I'll try and think about, is there another module that manipulates Drupal in a similar way? So when I was working on one module that had to create some, it was really more of a back-end focused module, but it was actually the redirect module that I used for reference. And so I was thinking about it in terms of something where the administrator is creating, it's effective. It seems like it's configuration, but it's actually stored as content entities. We'll talk about entities in a bit. But using that module as reference really helped me to look at, what are some of the methods that it uses, some of the classes that it defines, and so on. And so if you can find some of those similarities, then using some of those other modules and examining how they do some of the things that they do can be a good starting point as well. So hopefully, having done all of that, you should be in a pretty good spot to really start to plan out exactly what you need to build for your module. So start to think about, at a more granular level, what are the specific kinds of functionality that you want your module to provide? You might even go as far as writing out user stories. So commonly, a user story would take the format of a sentence that would go something like, as a blank user, so it could be an administrative user, I want to, let's say, define a search redirect so that, and then you describe the motivation. So it's so that someone who's bookmarked an old URL can get directed to where the new URL, where the same content resides. And so by building out a few of those, it can give you a very clear sense of some of the very specific things that your module needs to do, the type of user that needs to do them, and also to sort of articulate what their motivation is in trying to do those. And as a developer, those can be really useful. Probably want to think about, are there certain ways that your module should be configurable? So are there particular options where you think it's going to be hard to build the module to address every particular way that somebody's going to want to use this kind of, let's say, field widget that I want to build? So what are the ways that people should be able to configure it to meet a broader set of use cases? Again, try and go back to, are there existing sort of classes or methods or hook functions within either Drupal core or within existing contrib modules that you can leverage, so that you're really only having to, let's say, extend an existing class and then add on just the pieces that are really new in terms of what you're trying to add on, as opposed to sort of write that entire, as an example, plugin class from scratch. So that can be a huge time saver as well. Finally, then, what you want to also do from a planning standpoint is start to think about what is the data that needs to get stored. And so in all likelihood, there could be either configuration or content entities that your module needs to store. In kind of a Drupal 9 context, I would encourage you to try and think about those as entities, as opposed to thinking of writing sort of database API queries that are going to directly interact with the database table. If you put the extra work into defining those as entities, then you get a lot of kind of robust functionality in terms of being able to leverage a lot of really robust features for how to manage that data without having to kind of build it all yourself. So another important step, I think, is to really, particularly if you're new to all of this, try and get help from people who are more experienced. So some ways that you can get help from the community would be to start with your local Drupal user group. If you've been involved, if you've gone to some sessions before, there are probably people that you have kind of a personal relationship with, and that's probably going to be a really good way to be able to leverage some of their expertise, or even at least to get some feedback in terms of the things that you're trying to do. Drupal has its own Slack channels, and there's one for module development, but there may also be ones that are more topic focused that kind of align with what your module is trying to do. And those can be really good too, in terms of getting feedback or direction from people. There is a support channel, but in my experience, I would say it can be a little bit hit or miss in terms of whether or not you're going to get that answered in kind of a timely fashion. And there tend to be so many posts in there that if you don't get your question responded to right away, sometimes it'll just get buried. There is a contrib half-hour meeting that happens every so often. There's a link here to the project page on Drupal.org, and I think they usually announce it in that module development channel as well, so that can be a good resource. And obviously there are forums, so there's forums on Drupal.org, there's Stack Exchange, and some others. One thing to keep in mind if you're posting a question to one of those forums is to really try and be as detailed as possible. Maybe includes the specific code that you're trying to get working, because if you post a really general question, a lot of times people will just keep going because they don't want to get into a long back and forth just to try and tease out what's the specific information you're stuck looking for. So try and remember that. And just in general, look for people who can act as collaborators for you. So if one of the people that you talk to through one of these means sounds really interested and might be somebody that you could sort of ping through your process development if you get stuck in a certain place or want to bounce an idea off them, having somebody who can act as that kind of a collaborator for you is really going to be invaluable through this whole process. But hopefully now you're ready to sit down and actually start writing some code, and this is where the magic happens. So the fortunate thing is that there are very robust tools for writing code that literally won't cost you a thing. So you can download and install VS Code. I've linked here to a page on Drupal.org where it talks about how to set it up specifically for Drupal. So some of the recommended extensions, and one of the primary ones in there is for linting. And if you're not familiar with, the word linting, it's really an automated process of scanning the code often as you're actually writing it and checking it against the Drupal coding standards. And those coding standards are important, not only sort of stylistically, but there are standards in there that also help to improve the security of the code that you're writing. So for example, if you're passing a string into, let's say, a translation function, making sure that you're not just appending that directly to the string, but passing that in as a parameter is a way that is going to help Drupal to make sure that let's say if there's a user provided input in there, that's going to get sanitized before it gets output, and that'll help to prevent, cross-site scripting attacks and some of those other things. So it may seem trivial, to worry about whether, it's using tabs or spaces, but there are definitely some valid reasons. And particularly as you want your module to get adopted by the community, making sure that it adheres to some of these standards is going to be really important. Another thing that you should really think about as you're writing your code is to be writing automated tests as you go along. So another critical factor for people in terms of looking at whether or not to use a module sometimes is to see how much automated test coverage it has. And it's definitely easier to write the tests as you go, so that, because while it's still fresh and top of mind of what you were trying to do with a certain function or a certain class, to be able to write a test for it is much easier than sitting down as you're trying to get a release put together and trying to go through all of the code and figure out which has sort of test coverage and which doesn't, and what are the things that you need to test. If you have those user stories that we talked about earlier, those can be a really great way to write functional tests, because there's a lot of good insights in there in terms of the type of user and what they might be trying to do. So those can be helpful. And if you really want to get ambitious, there's even an approach to development called content or test-driven development, where the idea is you start by writing the test and then you only consider the code you're working on complete when you actually get the test to pass, and then you move on to the next test and so on. So that may be a bit ambitious if you're just getting started, but I'll float that out there as an idea that some of you may want to try. And again, the earlier and the more often you can get feedback on the work that you're doing, so whether it's somebody who can try out your code and give you feedback, ideally if you could even get somebody to do code review or any of that, it's definitely easier to course correct the sooner you start than well down the process to realize that you were using the wrong class to try and build out that form or something like that. So again, the sooner you can get feedback, the better the overall process is going to be for you. So hopefully now you've done all of your planning, you've written your code, and you're ready to get everything posted up to Drupal.org. So there's a page on how to set up your project, and I would definitely recommend initially starting as a sandbox because especially your first time, you're going to want to kind of iterate. There may be some things that you need to fix up and so on. And really only once you're really confident that your module is ready for people to use, that's the time where you want to promote it to a full project, because the last thing you want to do is to create this as a module and then realize that it doesn't work. Effectively, once you promote something to a project, it's going to stay a project. There's no way to sort of create a module and then remove it later on by yourself. Whereas sandbox projects can get spun up and you can delete it if you decide it's not useful or it entirely is a duplicate of another module or what have you. So definitely make sure that it's ready to share. I would say before you do this, again, you want to thoroughly go through your code and make sure that it complies with coding standards and all of those. And also there's a README template that's linked here in terms of really going through and spelling out what your module is designed to do, if there are steps required to install it or configure it, and all of those things. And again, that can be really important for people in the community who may want to try out your module. So the other thing that you get to do once you create your project page is put a lot of content in there in terms of trying to talk to the people who may be considering using your module. So again, there's a Drupal.org page that has a lot of really good suggestions in terms of things like, are there third-party dependencies, either another module or a different library that needs to be installed? You may want to give credit to your employer if they've given you time to work on the module. There are a few things like that, but to me, some of the key pieces of information that you can put on this page are again going back to what is that problem that your module is designed to solve. If you can articulate that clearly, I think that's really going to help people to understand if this is a module that's going to help them with their own particular site. There may be key features that you really want to call out because, again, those were some of the things you were excited about developing the module to provide in the first place. And then any of those modules that you had identified during your research phase that may be similar, you definitely want to call those out and then potentially say, this module is similar, but mine is different because it does X instead of Y. And again, providing those points of differentiation can really help people who may be considering using your module in terms of understanding which one is the better fit for their particular use case. Myself, when I post a module, I like to come up with some kind of a little logo to put on there. If it's something you'd like to do, you may have, again, somebody in your local users group or somebody who'd be happy to do one for you. But it's definitely not a requirement. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it, but I definitely would suggest trying to include some screen captures that sort of visually show that functionality that your module is really designed to provide. So you should be getting ready to the point now of actually creating releases. So that's sort of like a snapshot of your code that is meant to show a state of readiness. And one of the things that's described in one of those resources down below is you can tag it as alpha, meaning there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done. Beta means most of it should be working, but it may have some issues. A release candidate should have all of the functionality basically in place, but you're actually at that point really looking for feedback from the community as to whether they can find any bugs. But there's a lot more description on that down below. I would encourage you, when you're thinking about creating releases, to start by trying to do a smaller set of features and make them work really well, as opposed to, sort of trying to boil the ocean and make it do everything all out of the gate. If you can do a smaller number of things, but really make sure your code is kind of ironclad and secure and works without errors, people are going to be much more likely to to use your module right out of the gate and then stick with it as it kind of grows over time. Another key pain point that maybe a few of you have seen already in Drupal is modules that stay in beta forever. And I would really encourage you to try and think about how can you get that code to be stable as soon as possible so that people can have the confidence that there's a developer there who's really committed to making sure this works properly. It can be discouraging when you've been using a module for years and it's never had a stable release. So definitely trying to push towards a stable release, I think, is important. And as I say, you can use subsequent releases to add new features over time, and also that gives you a chance to listen to the people that are actually using your module and the ways that they'd like to see it grow, and that can potentially help you to sort of evolve that roadmap over time. So some of the other resources on this page are how to create a release, so the steps within Drupal.org that you need to go through. There's a resource here about semantic versioning, if you're not familiar with that, and also a guide on how to opt into security coverage, which can be important because there are some people who justifiably won't even consider installing a module on their website unless it has security coverage, and there's definitely a process to that. So I would encourage you to read that when you have the time. So at this point, we've got our module kind of released and ready to use. So what are the things that we can do to sort of let the community know that it's out there? A fantastic resource, and actually one of the sponsors of the Florida Drupal Camp, is the Weekly Drop. Got to give a huge shout out to Bob Kepford and all the work that he does to really be that place where the community can share information. Also, in my experience, has been very open to getting modules listed within the newsletter. But I would also suggest that maybe you wait to get it listed until the module is in a stable enough place that people aren't going to install it and get a bunch of errors or white screen of death or something. If people start having a lot of problems with your module right out of the gate, regardless of if it's an alpha 1 release, it may give them a bad experience that makes them reticent to try the module out, even in later releases. So how soon to try and get it listed in the Weekly Drop is maybe a bit of a judgment call, but it may also, again, if you're getting feedback from other people as you develop, that may be a bit of a gauge in terms of where it's at and whether or not it's ready to sort of broadcast to the world that it's available. If you have a blog available, publishing one or more blogs about your module as you're working on it can be really great too, because it gives you the opportunity to tell more of a long form story about why you wanted to create the module, some of the ideas that led up to you actually working on it. You can show lots more pictures in terms of maybe phases of development or different aspects of how to set it up and use it. Maybe there's even a client site that you've worked on, and you can talk about how it was received, maybe by users, any of those kinds of things. Just a great way to be able to tell a richer story around the module than you can really do on that sort of one project page. Being active in relevant Slack channels can also be a really good way. So, in my case, I was working on Smart Date, and so there's a date time channel in Slack, and so I would be in there, and if people were describing a problem that they were having that seemed to align with, again, that problem that I was hoping that Smart Date would solve, then I could say, hey, maybe you could check out this module that I've been working on. It sounds like it might help, and would definitely love to hear any feedback. And I think, again, partly how you frame that is going to be really key, particularly in sort of that community context. But, I guess at a more fundamental level, it really goes back to that idea of understanding the problem that you're trying to solve. And if you can find other people that have that problem, then that gives you an opportunity to share that module with them in a way that hopefully is going to help them and save them some time and aggravation. And then the last thing is really around doing presentations like this one, getting out to Drupal users groups and Drupal camps, and they always love to have new presenters and new content. And so lots of times they're going to be thrilled to have you in there to talk about what you're working on. And lots of times you can get, if there are pieces you're struggling with, even that may be a good way to get some feedback in terms of, how to overcome some of those challenges you may be having. And then kind of the last piece in this section is really around maintainership. And so you've got your module created, it's out there and people are starting to use it, but it's really important that over time, there's also the confidence that, if I run into a bug or it needs to be upgraded to work with Drupal 9 or some of those other things, that it's still being, looked after. And so the rule I try and go by is to be the maintainer that I wish all modules had. So if people are posting, I would say particularly a bug report, I try and get at least some kind of an update on the issue in a reasonable time frame. So I'll see if I can reproduce it, and then if not, I'll post some, a request for more sort of steps to reproduce. If it is something that I can reproduce, but maybe it feels like a real edge case to me, or it's something that I can't work on right away, then I'll say, I can definitely see the problem that you're having, but I may not be able to start working on that right away. Maybe you can offer a suggestion to say, the fix that you're looking for is probably in, this JavaScript file or in that class, kind of a thing, and sort of point them in the right direction so that maybe they can scratch their own itch and post a patch to help get it fixed. But at least helping to keep that dialogue going, I think a lot of times is going to be really, really helpful for people. Again, I'll talk about the importance of creating releases. It can be frustrating if you're having to use a module and you've having to install 8 different patches on it to get it to work, properly with the latest versions of Drupal and other modules. And so periodically making new releases that incorporate some of those patches and just make sure that it's up to date can be really helpful for the community. Another thing you should really consider is trying to write documentation. I think in the long term, that's probably actually going to save you a lot of time because it gives people the opportunity to potentially sort of solve their own problem. And so sometimes if people post a question that I think could probably be answered with some documentation, then I'll try and write up the documentation and then answer their support request with a link to that documentation page. Because ultimately, if they're having that problem, there's probably going to be other people that are going to have that same problem. And I don't want to have to be answering that again and again in my issue queue. And again, wherever you can, try and collaborate. So there may be people who post feature requests, post patches on those. You may have people that ask to be co-maintainers because they're really passionate about the work that you're doing in the module and want to help. Or it may be a case of reaching out to another module maintainer and saying, hey, I love your module, and I think it would be great if we could make ours work together. But I think those kinds of collaborations can be really awesome and can really help your module to sort of grow over time in terms of the capabilities of what it's going to be able to do. Wanted to also talk about, from a maintainership standpoint, some of the reasons why I actually really enjoy working on maintaining some of these modules that I work on. So in my sort of day-to-day work life, at the end of the day, I have paying customers who are kind of the final authority in terms of the website that I'm building for them and how it's going to grow and evolve over time. Whereas when I'm working on a module, I kind of get to be that voice of authority. I can decide that feature sounds great, but I don't think it's something that I need to incorporate in my module, or I can decide that sounds great and it's going to be something I'm going to start working on next month. But I can really sort of make those decisions in terms of what I think is right for the module, and also to some degree, what are the things that I'm passionate about working on? What are things that I'm interested in? And so it really gives me an opportunity to work on Drupal in a way that is also tied directly into the things that I'm interested in. And I've also learned a ton in the process of working on these modules. And so last year I did some of the Acquia Drupal certification, and I really found that having worked on the modules that I've been developing and maintaining had really made it significantly easier for me to write some of those tests. So if anything like that is in your aspirations, or even if you just want to get better as a Drupal developer, I think becoming a maintainer and helping to deal with some of those issues that people have can be a great way to learn and grow as a developer. So I have talked a little bit about Smart Date, and I mentioned it in the talk description. So I thought I'd quickly go through kind of the evolution of that module, and hopefully it'll kind of reinforce some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of how it came to be and the growth that it's had. So as you can see, in a little over 18 months, it's gone from basically being a sandbox project to now one of the 500 most popular modules on Drupal.org. And I really actually originally had the idea. I was working on a Drupal website back in 2009 that was event driven and doing some data entry, and really noticed that it was actually painful, the amount of data that I had to manually input as I went through and created all of these events. And I started thinking about why it was so different in Drupal compared to, say, popular calendar software like Google Calendar. And I started thinking about some of the kind of shortcuts and intelligence that they try to build into that interface, and in particular this concept of duration as a way to sort of pre-populate the end based on the entered start time. But I didn't really get around to writing any code to implement those ideas until almost 10 years later in 2019. And so went through that process of trying to find existing solutions. I did find some, and wasn't able to connect with anyone who was interested in potentially working together. There are other actually maintained modules that I wished I had found sooner, but in the course of working on the module, have definitely had some really interesting conversations with other developers. But I started off really with that editor experience that I was trying to make better and less cumbersome. I had identified some performance issues with the way that core datetime fields were storing the data that I wanted to be able to address. And then also around the same time, I was noticing that for a number of sites where I was building in event systems, that I was being asked to really customize the output of the event to be kind of more natural language in the way that it was presented. And so I decided that to address all of those, I really needed to create a new kind of field, and that became the basis of this module that I started to write. So in April of that year, created my sandbox. It was originally called timestamp ranges. And then as I got working on it, I was also collecting some feedback from some different people that I knew, and eventually ended up changing the name to Smart Date to try and convey the variety of different ways that I was hoping the module could make the process of working with events in Drupal better. Started to create some of those releases. And so by the end of May, I was up to my 6th beta release, at which point I was ready to create a blog about it and get it posted into the weekly drop. So it was just shortly after that I realized that the display configuration that I had set up for the field formatter was working well, but it was not translatable. And that was definitely one of the goals that I had, was to make sure that it could be set up to be appropriate to the sort of culturally specific date formatting preferences that happen in each language. Excuse me. And there was an issue open around making formatter configuration translatable, but I didn't want to sort of take the chance that it could be years before that issue would be resolved. So I decided to go ahead and create custom config entities as a way to store that configuration and make them translatable. And really been happy with the time that was invested for that, because it's really made, I think, the overall module much more robust. So by July of that year, I was able to create a stable release. And then since then have been working on implementing new features, again, really guided by some of the things that people who are using the module were putting into the issue queue around either feedback on different things or feature requests, and so since the stable release have added things like recurring dates, support for time zones, adding integration for full calendar view for that calendar presentation. One of the things that was added kind of mid last year was support for using at least the widget and formatter with core date fields, and then also making sure that everything was really optimized for working with some of the awesome new themes that are available with Drupal, like Olivero, Claro, and Gin. So, I think the keys to success for the module have really been a lot of things that we talked about. Really trying to identify some common problems that Drupal could address even better. I tried to provide both tools and solutions. So I tend to think of Smart Date itself as more of a tool in the sense that it provides this new field that you can configure to meet the needs of your site. But I also created these, I call them starter kits. So there's a Smart Date starter kit and there's a Smart Date calendar kit that are basically pre-configured ways of using Smart Date so that in a couple of minutes you can have a working event system added to your website. So it adds content type, it adds some views, and in the case of the calendar kit, you've got drag and drop administration capability added to your site, or really super easy. Had a lot of amazing community contributions, both in terms of bug fixes, but also new functionality. There was a German developer a couple of years ago who was really passionate about getting Smart Date integrated into a project he was working on. And so he added a lot of the drag and drop calendar functionality, which is amazing. And then I've really tried to, as I said, keep the site or the module well maintained, and really trying to align some of the development with what I'm hearing people need to use the module to address. And then from a promotion standpoint, writing a number of blogs, getting releases and some of those blogs into the weekly drop, and then doing as many presentations as I can to sort of help people to understand how it can be used. So there's some additional resources here. This is a Drupal.me module development guide. A lot of it is paid, but there are some free modules in there you can read, and then some extra resources from Drupal.org. Skipped ahead before I got to say the last thing. This last one is a command line tool for helping you to write release notes, which I have found to be super, super helpful. So with that, I am going to open it up for questions or comments.
Gotcha. This was an excellent presentation. We have really only about 1 minute. Does anyone have any questions or anything? I'm going to check the chat right now. I haven't been putting anything in there. So we have, what is the best way to send the to send the updates to the weekly job? And that's the answer right there. Just use the contact form. And someone posted a link to the the groups at Drupal.org New York City group.
Great.
And are you going to post your slides anywhere?
So the slides are actually already on the session listing on the Florida Drupal Camp site. So
cool. Okay. Well, because we're at time, let's wrap it up. But if anyone needs to reach out to you, I'm guessing they can reach out to you on Twitter or like I see your handle right there, MANDCLU.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's links on the on my profile on that page as well. So yeah, if you've got questions or feedback, would love to hear from you.
Cool. And just so everybody knows, there's lightning talks right now, so everybody can head over to that. You can check the schedule for the Zoom URL.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.